They came not with mercy, but with banners waving high and scimitars glinting in the sun, riding across the sands with the zeal of conquerors and the fire of prophets in their eyes. The caliphate, driven by ideology, empire, and the unrelenting thirst for dominance, swept through cities, towns, and villages, not only with military precision, but with spiritual authority. For many, the name of Islam brought hope. For others, particularly those whose homelands lay in the path of expansion, it brought suffering cloaked in scripture and conquest framed as divine right. Among the many people who stood in the shadow of the Islamic Caliphates, perhaps none felt the weight of that shadow more profoundly than the indigenous black communities of North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Once free in their own land, once proud of their own languages, their own religions, their own ancient empires, from Nubia to the Kingdom of Ghana, from Mali to Songhai, they were soon subjected to a new form of erasure, one that did not just seek to destroy their bodies, but to annihilate their memory, their culture, their dignity. The armies arrived first, swift, brutal, and efficient. They did not negotiate. They declared, submit to the faith, pay the jizya, or prepare to meet death. This jizya, a tax levied on non-Muslims, was not merely an economic policy. It was a symbol of subjugation, a spiritual branding that marked its bearers as dhimmis, protected, yes, but degraded. In the name of protection, dignity was stripped, and the conquered found themselves second class in their own lands. Their temples were burned, their books destroyed, their sacred rites outlawed. Conversion was rewarded, resistance punished, and memory itself became dangerous. What made the cruelty so bitter was not just the violence, it was the slow, systematic dismantling of identity. In Egypt, the Copts, descendants of an ancient people, were reduced to whispers in their own churches, forced to carry marks on their clothing to distinguish them from Muslims. In Nubia, once a bastion of Christian strength and architectural brilliance, the kingdoms collapsed under the caliphate's pressure, their churches dismantled stone by stone, their leaders silenced through negotiation that was anything but equal. Further west, across the Sahara, the great kingdoms of Black Africa were not spared. The trans-Saharan slave trade, spearheaded by Arab merchants and sanctioned by religious rulers, became a pipeline of human misery. Millions of black men, women, and children were shackled and marched across unforgiving deserts, their names lost to time, their stories buried beneath the sands. These were not just slaves, they were scholars, warriors, mothers, leaders, reduced to property, denied humanity. The story of these people is not told often, pent. And when it is dressed in the soft language of cooperation or mutual benefit. But there was nothing mutual about being forced to convert to avoid execution. There was no benefit in watching your child taken from your home to serve in a caliph's court, cut off from your culture and renamed to erase your lineage. There was no justice in the practice of castration, common in Islamic slavery, where young African boys were mutilated to serve as eunuchs in palaces. A brutal act that ensured both submission and silence. And yet, despite all this, there was resistance. Quiet, unyielding, sacred resistance. The griots continued to sing the names of fallen kings. Mothers whispered ancient prayers in darkened corners. Rebels raised their swords not just in the name of freedom, but in the name of memory. And memory, though trampled, never died. In the villages of Mali, Elders would tell stories of the time before conquest, of the gods that walked with their people and the ancestors who built empires of gold and learning. In the highlands of Ethiopia, one of the few African nations to resist Islamic conquest, churches were carved into solid rock, defiantly Christian, proudly African. In Timbuktu, even as Islamic rule tightened, black scholars wrote in secret, preserving astronomy, medicine, poetry, and philosophy in fragile manuscripts that still whisper truth to this day. Even within the caliphates, where power was centralized and absolute, there were those who pushed back, black generals who rose to command armies, enslaved people who led uprisings in the marshlands of Iraq. The Zanj Rebellion, a movement of enslaved East Africans in the 9th century, was a thunderous reminder that dignity could not be permanently extinguished. They fought not just for freedom, but for recognition that their suffering mattered, that their blood was not cheap, but the cruelty did not always come with a blade. It came with the slow replacement of names, the changing of languages, the teaching that Arab culture was superior, that the blackness of your skin marked you as closer to servitude than to sainthood. The pain of conquest was not only physical, it was psychological. It was in the erasure of identity and the rewriting of history. For centuries, the caliphates spread their influence with an iron resolve. Yes, there were moments of beauty, science, architecture, poetry, but these lights do not erase the darkness they cast over conquered peoples, especially those whose voices were silenced the longest. History is too often written by those who carry the pen and, rarely by those who carry the chains. The caliphates framed their rule as divinely ordained, and for many, their reign brought order, justice, and faith. But this was not universal. For the conquered, especially for black Africans whose stories were filtered through the eyes of their oppressors, justice came late, if at all. Dignity was taken, not offered, and the stories of pain were buried under layers of theology and empire. We remember the women who hid their sons when the slavers came, the warriors who fought to the death, so their village would not fall, the scholars who continued to write even when their language was banned. We remember not because we are bitter, but because memory is a weapon, a way to reclaim what was stolen, to dignify what was denied. This is not a story told to condemn a religion, but to confront an empire, to separate faith from conquest, to speak the names that history tried to erase, to remind the world that the dignity of a people cannot be permanently buried. No matter how deep the grave, we tell these stories, because silence is complicity. And for too long, the world has been silent about the cruelest things done under the banners of caliphates, about the long nights endured. The deserts still echo with footsteps of those dragged in chains, and those who walked with heads high even in defeat. The legacy of the Islamic Caliphates, though often celebrated for their contributions to art and science, cannot be told honestly without reckoning with the pain they inflicted upon conquered peoples, especially the black communities who endured centuries of marginalization, dehumanization, and the systematic erasure of their identities under the guise of religious empire in West Africa. The scars run deep. Before the caliphates reached these shores, civilizations flourished. Mansa Musa's Mali stood as a beacon of wealth, intellect, and culture. Ghana, long before Islamic dominance, had its own laws, its own gold, its own gods. But when jihadist leaders from the Maghreb began to sweep southward, spurred by a mission to Islamize and dominate, these independent powers were crushed, not simply with weapons but with ideologies. Those who refused conversion were taxed into ruin, ostracized, or killed. Those who submitted often lost more than their gods. They lost their voices, their languages, and the memory of who they had once been. The Fulani jihads in the 18th and 19th centuries, later echoes of that same imperial impulse, devastated black kingdoms. The Sokoto Caliphate, for instance, waged war not just for religion, but for control. It enslaved thousands. Entire cities were emptied. The conquerors built mosques atop sacred groves. The Quran replaced centuries of oral traditions. Children were re-educated to forget the names of their ancestors. And all of this was presented as salvation. Imagine what it means to be told your entire culture is sinful. To watch your mother's name stripped from records, to speak your native tongue only in whispers, because the new rulers demand Arabic. To walk past the graves of your ancestors and be forbidden to honor them. This was conquest of the soul, not just the sword. And yet, even in bondage, even in despair, dignity flared. It flared in the Maroons of West Africa. Communities of escaped slaves who retreated into forests and fought off recapture, living defiantly in freedom. It burned in the secret drums that echoed ancient rhythms long outlawed. It survived in the few who carried the stories forward, due child. Generation to generation, guarding memory like a sacred fire no empire could extinguish. In the heart of the Islamic world, the cruelty took another form, more insidious. The perception of blackness itself was reshaped under these caliphates. Arab scholars, echoing both Greek philosophy and local prejudice, began to codify ideas that dark skin equaled inferiority. Enslaved Africans were called Abid, a word meaning both slave and black. This fusion of race and servitude became entrenched in Islamic societies. Long before the transatlantic slave trade, even today, echoes of those ideologies remain. But we are not here to dwell in bitterness. We are here to remember truthfully, because without truth, there is no healing. Without memory, there is no justice. The cruelty was real, but so was the resistance. In the depths of the Abbasid Caliphate, a rebellion care, and there were others. Black soldiers in the Fatimid armies who broke ranks and turned their blades against their captors. Caravan leaders who smuggled enslaved families to safety. Poets who wrote in secret dialects, preserving lost languages beneath the rhythm of prayer. Historians who encoded truth in parables so that one day, someone perhaps you would remember. Because to remember is an act of defiance. And today, we defy the silence too often. The story of Islamic conquest is told as a civilizing mission, a narrative of enlightened rule and peaceful conversion. But peace bought through forced submission is not peace. Faith adopted at sword point is not faith. And civilization that erases the civilizations before it is no gift, it is theft. This is not a call for vengeance. This is not a rejection of Islam. It is a rejection of empire disguised as religion. It is a demand for truth, uncomfortable, unyielding truth. Because only through truth can we honor those whose names were stolen, whose languages were silenced, whose gods were desecrated. Some of those names we will never recover, but some still remain. The Black Prince of Makuria, who rode into negotiations with the Caliphate and dared to demand peace on equal terms. The unnamed girl, taken from East Africa to serve in a palace in Damascus, who sang lullabies in her native tongue until her death. The enslaved warrior who led 1,000 men into revolt in Iraq. knowing full well he would not survive the battle, but doing it anyway, so others might live. Courage, their resilience, their refusal to be forgotten, that is what we carry forward. And we, the descendants of the memory keepers, now bear a responsibility to tell the stories that textbooks gloss over, to speak the names that official histories bury, to hold up the mirror to empire and ask, who paid the price for your glory? If we do not speak, who will? For those who watch this channel, who seek justice, who crave dignity and historical truths, you are part of this reckoning. You are the voice they tried to silence, the future they tried to erase. You are the answer to every prayer whispered in chains, to every song sung in the dark. We tell these stories not to divide, but to connect, not to inflame, but to illuminate. Because history is not clean. It is blood-soaked and complex. But when we face it honestly, it can be healing. It can be sacred. The Islamic Caliphates left behind architecture, philosophy, and mathematics.